Thank you all for joining us today for this deep dive workshop on US and Australian climate action and infrastructure in Southeast Asia. I'm your host today, Winston Chow, Chief of Party of the USAID and Australia Mekong Safeguards Program, an ongoing effort between the aid agencies of both Australia and the United States to reduce negative social and environmental impacts of power plants, rails, and other infrastructure in the Mekong region, working with governments and companies in the region to transition to a model of regional sustainability. Bringing us to today's event, as Southeast Asia's economy grows and recovers from COVID-19, major investments in infrastructure are needed over the coming decades, both to meet increasing economic and commercial demand, but with countries in the region setting ambitious climate targets and pledges towards net zero carbon emissions for their economies, it's imperative that they receive needed supports to reach their sustainability goals. To open our deep dive event, I'm proud to introduce the Mission Director of the United States International Development Agency's Regional Development Mission for Asia. He served as USAID's Senior Deputy Assistant Administrator for Latin America and the Caribbean, as well as in East Africa and Haiti, leading post-earthquake reconstruction development efforts, the Philippines, Guam, and American Samoa. Based in Bangkok, Thailand, please welcome Dr. Steve Olive. Over to you, Steve.
Thank you very much, Winston, and welcome everyone. It's a great pleasure to share these opening remarks with Chargé d'Affaires Julia Feeney, who we at USAID work very closely with her and her team. So it's a great honor to share this stage with you. I would like to thank all of you for joining today. It's a really delight to be part of this year's Asia Clean Energy Forum, now in its 17th year, and open today's workshop to have a deeper discussion on the US government and Australia's climate change initiatives and programs supporting Southeast Asia. For over 80 years, the United States and Australia have been strategic partners. We share a long history of trade, investment, cooperation based on democratic values and common interests. And I congratulate Australians again for running a free and open and successful election of their own last month. One of those common interests in promoting sustainable infrastructure and building climate resilient communities. Today's workshop will highlight the US and Australia's joint efforts to develop climate smart and sustainable infrastructure in the region. In the spirit of this year's ASEF theme of innovative and integrative solutions needed to achieve a low carbon and resilient future, we wanted to highlight how successful partnerships, how shared investment and collective efforts can help achieve decarbonization and clean energy goals for the region. Today, we have the opportunity to discuss the ongoing and planned activities of the United States and Australian agencies and programs in Southeast Asia that seek to scale up and increase investments in climate smart and sustainable infrastructure. These include the United States International Development Finance Corporation, who's here with us today, as well as the US Trade and Development Agency, also with us, Australia's Partnership for Infrastructure, and USAID and Australia's Mekong Safeguards Program, for which Winston is leading. And I'm very proud of these partnerships. And today I want to specifically highlight the great work we are doing under the USAID and Australia Mekong Safeguards Program. It's like walking into a cafe where everything is 2 for 1, because we meet regularly and work so closely with our Australian counterparts that all of our monitoring and evaluation, all of our thoughts for future programs, all of our creative ideas that we have, it's 2 for the price of 1 because of our collaboration. And I'm very grateful for this partnership, and especially in the Mekong Safeguards Program as we've been a year into implementing it together. The program supports policymakers, government regulators, financiers, developers, contractors, and communities to foster the consistent application of strengthened environmental and social governance standards for infrastructure development. For example, the program is working with Thailand's Ministry of Energy to establish and incorporate environmental and social impact data into their national energy planning. The program also works with the Blue Dot Network, an initiative led by the United States, Australia, and Japan to certify infrastructure projects that meet robust international quality standards. Through partnerships like this, USAID and Australia work with Mekong countries to develop secure, climate resilient, and sustainable infrastructure throughout the region. These efforts are in line with the whole of government approach of the United States to confront the climate crisis. On Earth Day this year, USAID launched its own climate strategy, which sets ambitious targets that will guide USAID's programs in the Indo-Pacific through 2030. One of those targets is to improve climate resilience for 500 million people globally. The strategy guides USAID supporting countries to increase resilience of key infrastructure sectors, including supply and demand side systems of energy, transportation, communications, and water services. Building climate resilience infrastructure means people will be safer when disaster strikes and reduces the need for costly repairs after every storm. Beyond today's event, we welcome you to connect with various US and Australian agencies to learn more about the tools and resources available to support sustainable infrastructure development in the region. So thank you very much. Thank you for Winston for opening us and for your leadership of our US-Australian Mekong Safeguards program. And I wish all of you success in your efforts, and you can count on USAID as a partner. Back to you, Winston.
Okay, thanks. Thank you for your warm and informative remarks, Steve, and for emphasizing the vitality and importance of this strategic partnership between the US and Australia. Our next opening speaker is the Chargée d'Affaires for the Australian Embassy in Thailand. She served as permanent representative to the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and served as Assistant Secretary for Climate Change and Environmental Policy. She served again in senior positions in Europe and was a vital actor in Australia's bid for the United Nations Security Council. We're extremely fortunate to have her with us today. Please welcome Julia Feeney.
Thank you very much, Winston. And good afternoon to everybody. It's great to be here today, especially alongside USAID Mission Director Steve. As he said, it's a bit of a 2-for-1 with Australia and the United States in this space. Today's event is a collaborative effort brought to you by Australia and USAID's Regional Development Mission for Asia. I extend a warm welcome to other US government agencies joining us on the panel, including the US International Development Finance Corporation and the US Trade and Development Agency. One very important shared goal for Australia and the United States is action on climate change. The new Australian government will take a very ambitious and constructive role in international efforts to combat the climate crisis. The new government has committed to a more ambitious 2030 target to reduce emissions to 43% below 2005 levels, putting Australia on track to achieve net zero by 2050. We will enshrine this in the law and will submit a new nationally determined contribution to the UNFCCC. On renewables, our plans will see a portion of renewable energy in our national energy market increase to 82% by 2030. Evidence provided by the UN's International Panel on Climate Change 6 assessment report is alarming. Grounded in scientific data, the report details widespread, rapid, and intensifying impacts of climate change, which are unprecedented and largely irreversible. And for many Mekong sub-regional countries, the threat of climate change is even greater. In response to the global climate threat, Australia and USAID are working across the region to support the development of climate-smart and sustainable infrastructure. For example, Australia's Partnerships for Infrastructure fosters inclusive growth through sustainable economic infrastructure across Southeast Asia. And the Mekong Australia Partnership has a core focus on energy and climate. Per a recent report by the Asian Development Bank, investment demands for infrastructure in Southeast Asia are enormous and growing. Supporting the transition to sustainable infrastructure will improve all of our lives, providing access to cheaper and cleaner energy sources. Building sustainable infrastructure means not only making traditional power sources like gas and hydropower less harmful, but also helping governments and investors switch to renewable energy sources like solar and wind. USAID and Australia's mission in the region to help ensure this growth is healthy and sustainable, and the infrastructure of investment and development produce stable, clean, and resilient economies. Thank you all for joining us today, and we will obviously continue to work very closely with Steve and his teams here on these very important issues. Thank you very much, Winston.
Okay, thank you, Julia, for extending your warm welcome to the US agencies joining us today and for highlighting the massive challenges the world is facing with regards to climate change and Australia's ambitious climate goals, a blueprint in many ways for the region and the world. So leading into our technical presentations, our next speaker will speak with us about the United States Climate Action Strategy and investments in Southeast Asia. She comes to us from the US International Development Finance Corporation and serves as Regional Managing Director for the Lower Mekong. Her expertise in development finance spans over 15 years, where she's worked for the US Overseas Private Investment Corporation, as well as IBM and development consultancy firm Apt Associates. Please welcome Maria Gorvanci.
Thank you, Winston. It's a pleasure to be with all of you this afternoon. Next slide, please. The U.S. International Development Finance Corporation, or DFC for short, is the U.S. government's development finance institution that's dedicated to mobilizing private capital to projects that will achieve positive impact in the developing world to finance solutions to the most critical challenges facing the emerging market, while also advancing American foreign policy and American commercial competitiveness in these markets. The investments DFC mobilizes serve as stabilizing forces in low-income and lower-middle-income countries globally by supporting sustainable economic growth. DFC's investments adhere to strong international standards, particularly in respect of environmental, human rights, worker rights, and governance standards. We apply these standards across all of our projects, irrespective of sector, along with evaluating each transaction for its development impact through our impact quotient scoring, and evaluating the commercial viability of the investment to ensure a comprehensive and sustainable economic impact in these markets. Next slide, please. In terms of climate action, DFC has responded to the call through our administration's request to put forth a publicly available climate action plan that was published toward the latter half of 2021. Our two key goals is to move toward focusing of at least 33% of our portfolio of new investments on climate projects beginning in fiscal year 2023. Though admittedly, we've already begun working on such projects and financing them prior to this date. The other key driving goal for us as an agency is to move toward achieving net zero in our portfolio, net zero emissions in our portfolio by 2040. As we all know, climate change has a disproportionate impact on developing countries, which are often more vulnerable to natural hazards given existing challenges with poverty, food insecurity, lack of access to energy, and connectivity. DFC's development mandate, combined with its diverse financing tools, makes it an essential component of the US's ability to confront the climate crisis in developing countries, and by extension, internationally with like-minded partners. To advance these commitments, we've not only identified these two key climate goals that I've shared with you this afternoon, but we are trying to implement this through the following 4 pillars captured on this slide. 1, trailblazing adaptation investments. So focusing on the devastating impacts of climate change already being felt and faced by emerging markets, particularly in Southeast Asia, and creating projects or identifying investments that ensure that communities can cope and build necessary resilience toward that. Building on DFC's strong track record and expertise in supporting clean energy investments that contribute to mitigating climate change, we're also aiming to prioritize sectors including agriculture, forestry, water management, and strengthening food and water security to support these needs. Secondly, we're building a cutting-edge climate portfolio. Climate investments have the potential to address a series of intersecting and highly strategic priorities. DFC's climate investments can achieve key strategic interests such as diversifying global supply chains, achieving universal energy access, or highlighting the US government's ability to finance cutting-edge climate technology like battery energy storage and other technology to support EV infrastructure. And thirdly, mobilizing climate capital. Mobilizing additional capital is imperative to ensuring that climate change is adequately addressed. No one single player has enough resources to address the demand and challenge that faces all of us, and thus the need to attract private financial flows and crowd in other like-minded partners is critical to achieving these goals. DFC is creating valuable partnerships with other like-minded institutions such as the US federal agencies represented today on the panel, like USAID and USTDA, as well as through the Mekong Australia partnership that also has shared commonalities in supporting and strengthening international standards from an environmental and social perspective. In addition to partners with the Australian government through the Partnership for Infrastructure, who is bringing in additional tools to support the value chain of investments at different junctures. In May 27th of this year, development finance institutions and agency leaders from Australia, India, Japan, and the US convened in Tokyo to enhance collaboration to overcome the infrastructure development challenges facing us in the Indo-Pacific. Through the representation of Export Finance Australia, the Australian Infrastructure Financing Facility for the Pacific, India Export-Import Bank, Japan Bank for International Cooperation, and DFC, as I mentioned, gathered to better identify the key areas that we could work together to support with our various either financing tools or technical assistance to bolster and identify investments that could benefit from our collective tools. This included essential priority areas in the region, such as climate change, secure and reliable telecommunication networks, sustainable supply of energy, food and medical security, and global supply chain resilience and diversification. Next slide, please. This next slide captures the 5 priority sectors that DFC is looking to support in an effort to further bolster our climate portfolio. As I noted, climate is also a cost-cutting initiative. So not only does it focus on green infrastructure, but also clean energy, energy efficiency, power generation and transmission, but also targeted investments that are seeking to purposefully reduce greenhouse gas emissions and methane emissions. Next slide, please. In terms of how we can contribute to the partners around the virtual table on this panel, DFC can support climate investment through our financing tools. Predominantly, we can offer long-term debt financing either through direct loans or financial guarantees with very large ticket sizes and long tenors depending on the underlying investment context and contractual arrangements. We can also help de-risk these investments by providing political risk insurance to either reinsure or increase underwriting capacity, or perhaps through political risk insurance to de-risk an equity investor's investment in those transactions. We also have the ability to provide direct equity authority and provide a minority shareholding position at the company level for companies who are focused on climate change. So this could be, for example, a company who's looking to develop plastic recycling initiatives or EV infrastructure and charging in this part of the world. And we are augmenting our financing with targeted technical development assistance that might need strategic TA for capacity building or later stage studies to reach financial close on these targeted investments in climate. Next slide, please. I briefly wanted to share with the audience and those of us around the virtual table a few examples of transactions that we've supported in conjunction with our partners. The first being improving availability of secure telecommunications across the Indo-Pacific. DFC approved a $190 million loan to Trans-Pacific Networks, a private company that's building the longest subsea telecommunications cable from California to the Indo-Pacific and Southeast Asia. The proceeds of the DFC loan is specifically supporting the financing of the branch to Palau, a lower income island, to support the development of this larger telecommunications network. We, of course, are not doing this alone, and this would not be made possible without the advanced cooperation efforts and concurrent co-financing efforts by Australia's Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, Export Finance Australia, and the Japanese Bank for Infrastructure and Cooperation. Together, we've been able to crowd in financing necessary for this large 5G digital infrastructure, thereby improving the availability of secure international bandwidth capacity in the region. Next slide, please. Another example of climate financing that we've approved is Energy Access Relief Fund. Through this structure, DFC has provided low-cost loans to viable off-grid energy providers that serve low-income communities across 50 countries in both Asia and Africa. The fund is a collaboration, again, with development institutions in the impact investment space, and also supports our mobilization of capital requirements to support climate change through partners like FMO, the Dutch Development Agency, the UK Development Agency, BII, formerly the CDC Group, the IFC, and the Rockefeller Foundation and Shell Foundation. Through this, we're deploying $100 million of financing to small and medium businesses who would otherwise have challenges accessing or unlocking such capital, given their size, to support off-grid solutions, solar home systems, clean cook stoves, and solar power irrigation. Next slide, please. The next example is one in our recycling plastic space, where we've supported Circulate Capital and Treaty Oasis through a guarantee structure, whereby which DFC's guarantee helped to mobilize $100 million to reduce plastic waste in oceans in Southeast Asia and build value chains that convert waste into usable products while also creating jobs. DFC's investment to Treaty Oasis also happened to be in support of a woman-owned and managed business that also helped address our financial inclusion metrics in addition to our climate metrics to further reduce plastic waste in Southeast Asia. Next slide, please. I think before I conclude, I just wanted to share a few more slides that explain at a high level what DFC looks for in terms of eligibility. If you are looking to raise capital for a climate investment and are requiring financing. So in brief, we're looking at 6 key questions, and I'll walk through these questions through a live example of a deal that we financed in Vietnam to make it, to contextualize it. Next slide, please. So in this example, this was a climate-related investment that supported aquaculture and sustainable fish farming, and also helped reduce methane emissions through the techniques employed in this investment. We provided an $11 million loan to expand an open water fish farm in Vietnam. And in terms of applying this investment to our eligibility requirements, just in brief, quickly, the first question is the investment in a country where DFC is open for business? In this case, it was. We are open in Vietnam, and the link provided in the earlier slide discloses all the markets where we're open for business. Secondly, is the proposed investment commercially viable? Is there an investment plan or business plan that can demonstrate commercial viability and repayment for the intended product? Third, is the company or investor looking for a financing product that DFC offers? Fourth, does the investment have a double and triple developmental impact? So is it not only commercially viable, but is it doing something intentful or purposeful to help improve the environmental context and social context in the market, to increase jobs, provide knowledge that hasn't been previously available, sharing knowledge, innovation, etc. Fifth, does the developer or the sponsor who's seeking to roll out the investment have an expertise in the sector or region? And lastly, to what extent has the company or investor been unable to raise private capital from commercial markets? In other words, why would a DFC or a DFI be additional to the project context? Next slide, please. I think in closing, I'll just leave you with our project life cycle that captures the various stages that we would go through if you are interested in seeking DFC financing. I would welcome any questions that you have, and would just like to reiterate that we are one of many tools featured today in today's panel. And working together, we can help address these critical challenges in climate finance by crowding in our financing, but also crowding in our tools that would be applicable either at early stages, like those of USTDA that you'll hear from later in the presentation, or in the middle, like P4I, or toward the back end for the financing for investments depending on their life cycle, such as DFC. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you, Maria, for speaking about the U.S., how the U.S. interacts with private sector capital and infrastructure projects in the region, both in the development context as well as across how such projects can mitigate and adapt to climate change impacts. Whoops, one moment. I do want to remind everyone in the audience that if you have questions or comments, please click the Q&A tab in the upper right-hand corner of your interface, and we'll get to these questions soon. Our next speaker comes from the United States Trade and Development Agency, and will talk about the agency's outlook for climate action and facilitating sustainable growth in Southeast Asia. He serves as USTDA's Deputy Regional Manager for Southeast Asia and has worked in the energy field for Tetra Tech, USAID, and South Pole Carbon Asset Management for more than a decade. Please welcome our good friend, Siddhisak Apichatanopat. Over to you, Kunsang.
Thank you, Winston. Just before I get started, I just want to double check if people can see my screen and my presentations.
I can see it.
Okay, great. Let's get started then. Good afternoon, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be at ASEF again this year, and this time with the opportunity to present on our agency work to support climate smart infrastructures in the regions. Just a very quick introduction. USTDA, or US Trade and Development Agency, we are the project preparation facility of the US government. We support exclusively early stage project preparation activities of large-scale infrastructure projects in developing countries and emerging markets. We do have a couple of mandates, as you may have guessed from the name of our agency, one on trade and another one on development. And on the development side, we help prepare high-quality, sustainable infrastructure projects in our partner countries, and in turn, we hope to make positive contributions to the growth of your economies. And on the trade side, we would like to be that bridge connecting our overseas partners to US technologies and industry expertise. USTDA has a long track record of working in this region, and we have supported over 485 major infrastructure projects across all 10 ASEAN member states. While we are a relatively small agencies, we do have a pretty broad footprint across these regions. In addition to our resources in our headquarters in Washington, D.C. But personally, I sit in our regional office in Bangkok and do cover the Southeast Asia as well as the Pacific Island countries. But in addition, we also have country offices and representatives in Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam, and are in the process of opening another office in Manila, hopefully later on this year as well. We also have a South Asia regional office based in New Delhi, but this is being managed by a different team altogether. But I'm happy to make connection to any of you who might have an interest in working with us in that market as well. And before I move on to the next slide, I just want to note that as a trade promotion agency, a key matrix for measuring our success is the export multiplier. And as you can see from the slide here, for every dollar that USTDA has invested, we have been able to generate on average $117 of US exports. That said, I would like to emphasize that our support is not tied, and we won't be requiring you to procure US goods and services upon acceptance of our support. But we do, of course, encourage you to consider offerings from US firms so long as they meet your selection criteria, whether in terms of quality or price. So advancing climate smart infrastructure solution is really a high priority for USTDA and at the core of our missions. As I'm sure many of you are aware, climate change is a core tenet of President Biden's foreign policies, and agencies like USTDA are tasked to help our partners adapt to and manage the impacts of climate change. And with this, just in April last year, President Biden has launched USTDA Global Partnership for Climate Smart Infrastructure Initiative, whereby we had committed to invest at least $60 million to help put emerging markets on a sustainable climate pathway, and at the same time connect US industry to major clean energy and transportation infrastructure projects in these markets. And I'm pleased to share with you that, just in its first year since its launch, we have already invested more than $30 million in activities to help our overseas partners achieve their clean energy and transportation goals. This includes more than 24 of project preparation activities and partnership building activities that are designed to help unlock more than $50 billion in climate finance. So how does USTDA support our partners' climate objective and sustainable infrastructure development? As you can see from the slide here, we do have a couple of buckets of on-demand tools that are available to support public and private entities. The first bucket is our project preparation grant, which is really our bread and butter, whereby we typically provide grant funding in a range of $500,000 US to $1.5 million to engage US firms to help you with feasibility studies, master plan, technical assistance, engineering and design, as well as pilot projects. The other bucket is our partnership building program, whereby we can help organize conferences, workshops, trainings, or reverse trade mission, which the latter is essentially a study tour whereby we bring a delegation from this region to the US so that they can be exposed to US technologies and industry best practices. I would like to give you some example of our recent grants that we just signed over the last year in support of the Global Partnership for Climate Smart Infrastructure Initiative, one of each from Thailand, Vietnam, and Tonga in the Pacific Island as well. The first project is in Thailand is with SCG, Siam Cement Group, who is one of the conglomerates in Thailand, to help them develop a roadmap to guide the deployment of electric vehicle fleets and charging infrastructures across the company's operations in Thailand. Here, USTDA is helping to fund a detailed technical analysis and plans prepared and co-funded by US engineering firm called Black & Veatch to help SCG accelerate their plans for EV adoption, installation of charging stations, and integrated renewable energy infrastructures, which cover over 130 sites and around 14,000 vehicle fleets across their operation in Thailand. A grant will also help them design pilot projects in at least 3 identified sites. The second project here is in Vietnam, which was actually just signed during the US-ASEAN Leaders Summit last month. You can see in the photo here, the Prime Ministers of Vietnam, together with the US Secretary of Commerce, USTDA directors, and our grantee, Mekong Clean Energy Interconnection, or MCEI, who is actually the subsidiary of the Delta Offshore Energy. Our grant will help fund a feasibility study to support the development of a 130 kilometers, 500 kV transmission line project that will support VIE integrations and help meet the rising power needs of the Mekong River Delta and southern Vietnam more broadly. Next is an example from Tonga, whereby we are working with the state-owned utility Tonga Power Limited to prepare a feasibility study to support the power sector decarbonization goals. Our study will help analyze the technical and economic feasibility study of a variety of distributed energy resources and infrastructure solution, including RE installation, electric vehicle, public transit fleet conversions, as well as smart grid infrastructures. The study would be co-funded and performed by US Clean Energy Analytics and consulting services company called Grid Market based in New York. Moving on to our partnership building programs, I would like to highlight a few examples of our reverse trade missions, whereby we bring public and private sector officials to the United States for 1 to 2 weeks visit to learn about US technologies and industry best practices. The first example here is termed as the EGAT Executive Training Program, whereby the visit in the US will help prepare current and future leaders of the Electricity Generating Authority of Thailand, or EGAT, for energy sector's modernization in Thailand. The program consists of 2 separate missions. One was actually just completed and another is ongoing and involve visit to Washington, DC, Bay Area in California, and Eastern Washington State in a small town called Pullman, which I haven't actually been there myself as well. But the training mission will focus on introducing solutions to accelerate Thailand power sector decarbonization goals, particularly in view of meeting Thailand's and EGAT's pledges to reach carbon neutrality by 2050. We also have a mission on Thailand railway modernization that is just about to commence this weekend, actually, whereby we will bring a delegation from the Ministry of Transport in Thailand, State Railway of Thailand, Mass Rapid Transit Authority of Thailand, and the Rail Technology Research Institutes to Washington, DC, Illinois, and New York. The program will aim to familiarize Thai rail officials with US technologies, services, and best practices for modernizing and expanding rail system. Our aim is to support Thailand efforts to improve efficiency of logistic networks and lower emission from road transport by shifting market share to rail. Finally, we are just about in the process of organizing a waste to energy reverse trade missions. This is still in the works, but we are hoping to bring a delegation from Indonesia to the US and introduce them to US technologies and best practices for biomass and MSW processing and power generation. The mission will also share solutions for enhanced waste management and reduce greenhouse gas emissions and pollution. And the visit will be again in Washington, DC, Illinois, and California. So I hope I have presented you with a comprehensive overview of what USTDA is doing to advance climate smart infrastructures in this region. I would like to end by saying that USTDA maintains an open window to consider new grants and program requests. And if you are interested in working with us, please feel free to submit a short concept note to initiate an application process. On this slide, you can also see some of the key criteria that we use to evaluate proposals. And I have also provided our contact details in the last slide. So please feel free to reach out to us for further discussion. And I'm also happy to answer any questions now or later. And thanks again for the opportunity to be here today. Back to you, Winston. Thanks.
Thank you, Kun Seng, for talking about USTDA's programs in the climate action context. It's always important to note that the partnership between the Australian and US aid agencies accesses resources that go beyond both agencies, but to the breadth of government-wide departments such as agencies such as USTDA in our climate action toolbox. So our next speaker comes to us from EY, a partner organization to Australia's Partnership for Infrastructure, and he'll be speaking with us about Australia's support for Southeast Asia's clean energy transition. He currently serves as Energy Advisor to P4I and is a director in EY's Infrastructure and Economics Advisory. Prior to that, he's worked for KPMG, AME Group, and as an analyst for the Australian Energy Regulator. Please welcome Mr. Nam Le.
Thank you very much, Winston, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nam Le from the Australian Government's Partnerships for Infrastructure program, and it's a pleasure to be here alongside USAID, DFC, USTDA, and other colleagues for this deep dive workshop. As previously explained, an important priority for Australia in the region is to work with partners, including USAID and other US agencies, to support the development of climate smart and sustainable infrastructure. And one of the critical enablers of this is an energy sector that can provide cleaner, cheaper, and more secure sources of energy. In this session, I'll aim to provide you an overview of Australia's support to Southeast Asia's clean energy transition, covering the trends and issues in energy that Australia observes in the region, how Australia structures its support through two important and complementary programs, Partnerships for Infrastructure, as well as the Mekong Australia Partnership, and what impact Australia aims for in the energy transition in the region. I really welcome the opportunity to contribute to what should be an important and informative session going forward. So firstly, on the trends and issues that Australia observes. At a high level, the overall story and rationale underpinning the energy transition globally, as well as in Southeast Asia, is relatively clear, and it's been well discussed, including very eloquently by many of my fellow speakers. But to put it simply, there can be huge benefits by providing access to cleaner and more affordable energy to improve all of our lives. But this requires huge investments across all countries in the region, from a range of sources, and across all aspects of the energy sector or market. So we're not just talking investment in physical infrastructure and assets like new generation sources and transmission grids, but also in human capabilities, processes, systems and tools, research and development, pilot projects and incentive programs, to name a few. And putting all of this together, this requires huge international support. Australia, like many international partners, view energy and climate as an urgent global challenge and will work with the international community to meet this challenge. More broadly, Australia is keen to step up its partnership in the region, and over the past 18 months, through programs like Partnerships for Infrastructure and the Mekong Australia Partnership, we have been engaging with our Southeast Asian partners to understand sectoral priorities and where and how Australian expertise can best be harnessed to support the energy transition. And through this, there have been a few recurring messages and trends worth identifying now that we have heard that has some pretty important implications for how Australia can best provide its support. Firstly, it's becoming increasingly difficult to look at the energy sector's challenges and the opportunities of the energy transition in isolation. Energy is so interconnected with every other part of the economy, society, and community. Good energy outcomes, such as what could be possible as part of the energy transition, can have such an important and foundational impact on the development and growth of the region. Secondly, we are certainly hearing an increasing demand for flexibility in the different types of support, how and when it is delivered, drawing upon a range of tools and modalities. And thirdly, there is a greater demand for longer lasting and more meaningful partnerships, focusing on developing the people-to-people relationships, as well as sharing knowledge and skills that lie at the heart of shared prosperity. And these recurring messages and trends have shaped the way that Australia structures its programs to support the energy transition. And to do this, Australia has two main complementary programs that focus on various aspects of energy in the Mekong and the Southeast Asian region. Firstly, the Mekong Australian Partnership, or MAP, which was announced in November 2020, is an initiative building on Australia's long-standing bilateral programs with Mekong states to enhance Australia's engagement in the sub-region. It comprises several pillars, but most notably the Mekong Australia Partnership Water Energy Climate pillar, which focuses on building environmental resilience to strengthen water security, address riverine and marine pollution, and most importantly, promote cleaner energy and respond to climate change. The MAP WEC program supports Australia's Partnerships for Recovery policy, which works with regional countries to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic by helping to build relationships, share knowledge and skills to enable a sustainable recovery. Secondly, Partnerships for Infrastructure, or P4I, is the Australian government's flagship program, which commenced in January 2021, which has the aim to foster inclusive growth through sustainable infrastructure in Southeast Asia. P4I works across a range of sectors, including energy. And one of the hallmarks of P4I is the speed, flexibility, and breadth of tools, which we are already putting to good use with a significant pipeline of activities and opportunities in energy across the region. So how does P4I work in terms of the key tools and modalities? Firstly, there is a really strong support for government-to-government engagement and partnerships between Australia and Southeast Asian counterparts to share experience, undertake secondments, and navigate some of these critical policy and technical challenges together. Secondly, there's collaboration, knowledge sharing, and institutional twinning among other types of entities, such as think tanks, universities, and industry groups. And thirdly, the third main important tool is advisory services through P4I's program partners, EY, my organisation, as well as the Asia Foundation. And this type of advice is very flexible, including providing rapid, quick response, as well as longer-term technical assistance, policy and planning inputs and capacity building. Embedded across all of this work are the following cross-cutting priorities that we all know are essential to quality infrastructure, gender equality and social inclusion, as well as disaster risk reduction and climate change. So it's important to note that P4I and the Mekong Australia Partnership are just two selected examples of discrete initiatives that Australia uses to support the energy transition. An important feature of Australia's broader strategy is the use of government partnerships. Australia has been advancing its own rapid energy transition, and the role of government in enabling and facilitating this has been pivotal. So while Australia has a lot to share, we also have a lot to learn, and through P4I and MAP, we look for our own governments, as well as industry, academics and research community, those that are actually at the forefront of the energy transition in Australia, to help play a critical role in supporting the energy transition in Southeast Asia as well. To illustrate a recurring challenge that we have heard in Southeast Asia is on the deployment of new variable renewable energy and how to safely and sustainably integrate this into the network and system. In Australia, we are seeing very significant growth in all types of renewable energy, but particularly rooftop solar. For example, around 30% of all homes in Australia, that's 3 million homes in total, have rooftop solar. And if all rooftop solar was combined to form a single generating unit, it would total 17 gigawatts of capacity, which would be the largest generating unit in Australia by some margin. Further, in the state of South Australia, across 6.5 days in December 2021, 101% of electricity demand was met by renewable energy. In this case, a combination of wind, rooftop solar, and utility scale solar. In addition, energy in Australia is seeing a very substantial shift towards more decentralized and dynamic models. Gone are the days when customers would purchase electricity from large generators transported through the grid, and there's a big movement towards a very different model with smaller wind and solar farms, the use of storage, and dispersed geographically. So what this means is it's a very substantial transformation in Australia that's affecting all parties, generators, grid operators, customers, policymakers. And as these trends accelerate, the Australian government's already substantial role in the energy transition in Australia is increasing and getting more complex. And so this role not only includes regulation, policymaking, but also a critical role in facilitating and incentivizing technology investment. Australia's National Strategic Decarbonisation Roadmap focuses on developing low-cost energy and low emissions technologies, with the main objective of the strategy being to invest and develop these technologies so that they become the cheapest and most economic source of energy. So overall, Australia is devoting a lot of resources and efforts to enable this in Australia, and recognises the equal importance of collaborating in the energy transition globally, and in particular in efforts in Southeast Asia through programs like P4I and MAPWEC. So these programs are very well placed to draw upon the practical experience in Australia's own energy transition, with the aim to help improve decision-making, strengthen capabilities, and attract investment to help provide cleaner, cheaper, and more secure sources of energy across Southeast Asia that can improve the lives of all. Through P4I, MAPWEC, and other Australian initiatives, we aim to achieve this and support the energy transition by focusing on establishing longer-term and more meaningful partnerships, offering a full suite of flexible ways to provide support across our programs and initiatives, and taking a coordinated approach, both within Australia and with our international partners. So that concludes my remarks on Australia's support to the clean energy transition in Southeast Asia. Thank you very much for the opportunity to contribute, and look forward to further discussions and hopefully working together in future on this important challenge. Many thanks.
Okay, thank you, Nam, for discussing P4I's important energy mission with the climate action within the climate action space in Southeast Asia. Before we go on to our next speaker, I'd ask that everyone in the audience right now or anytime during the rest of the session, please press on the feedback tab to the right side of the screen to fill out a brief survey. It's very important for us, lets us know how we're doing, and important to our understanding and learning of how to better work and inform key actors such as yourselves on the challenges of climate action and how to work together. So if you can press the feedback tab now or anytime during the rest of the session, it's really, really important to us that you fill out that survey. Thank you. Okay, our next speaker is here with us on social safeguards in climate smart infrastructure. She serves as Senior Social Safeguards Advisor to the USAID and Australia Mekong Safeguards Program at the Asia Foundation, and her career spans over 15 years working for organizations such as the Asia Disaster Preparedness Center, Environmental Resources Management Group, and as a lecturer and researcher to the University of Connecticut and Harvard Law School in Washington, D.C., Connecticut, and even in Kathmandu, Nepal. Please welcome Ms. Surjana Bhattarai.
Thanks, Winston. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining. It's a pleasure to be here. And I want to start by giving a very brief introduction to the USAID and Australia Mekong Safeguards Program. It's a 5-year program that's commenced in 2018. And will go until 2023. It supports policymakers, government regulators, major financiers, communities, contractors with technical assistance to strengthen ESG standards, particularly in the energy, transport, and water sectors. And we've heard from all the speakers that we know that major donors and lenders are ramping up infrastructure investment in the region, and it's more important so to ensure social safeguards in doing so. It's implemented by the Asia Foundation-led consortium, and its goal is to reduce environmental and social impacts in large energy projects. It's funded by DFAT and USAID. And I also want to highlight here that there are several programs that's funded by USAID DFAT in the region, and we work on collaboration to avoid duplication and to find complementarities across projects. So here I want to talk about social safeguards, particularly social safeguards in development. So we hear about environmental and social governance law. It's a set of ESG factors that's considered by companies and investors with a focus on risks, impacts, and opportunities. So, I mean, it's very optimistic that ESG has now shifted from the margins into the mainstream. However, there's a lot of work to be done in terms of application of the ESG on the ground, in terms of implementation of this project. And that's where we're focusing. In the recent times, there's been a lot of focus in the S of the ESG, also because social aspects are not always very easy to quantify. It's very nuanced, it's ever changing in the context of our societies and communities. And just to also point out that there was a 2021 global ESG survey that was done by BNP Paribas, which also revealed that 51% of investors that were surveyed, and there were about 356 institutions, found the social aspect to be the most difficult to analyze and incorporate in investment strategies. So what that means is also there's a risk of shying away from comprehensive reporting on social safeguards. So even more so to focus on that. To manage the social risks, we have social safeguards in place. By that, we refer to policies, procedures, measures intended to first always prevent and then reduce, mitigate, or compensate some of the social risks that we see in projects. Now, who values from it? Everybody. I don't think I need to focus more on the value proposition because we all know that it enhances sustainable development, especially when we're talking about the immense climate risk that we're facing today. We have to focus on ensuring social performance. It creates long-term value that benefits all stakeholders. The initial focus was mostly focusing on shareholders, but we're moving away from, focusing on all stakeholders to benefit, that will benefit from all these projects. And it also allows companies and projects to identify non-financial risks. For the longest time, the focus has been on financial risks, but companies are also realizing that to get a stakeholder buy-in in the project, you need to focus on social, environmental and social safeguards in general. There was a study that was done by IFC, which reviewed the performance of 656 investments over a period of 2010 to 2015, and found that companies with better ENS performance outperform clients with worse ENS performance by 210 basis points on ROE and 110 on return on assets. And lastly, it also optimizes risk management, including reputational risks. We know that there's a lot of risks that we hear about, especially in supply chain issues, impacts on cultural heritage resources that was not properly managed and so on. So with that, I want to focus on some of the key things that the Mekong Safeguards Program is doing within the social safeguards area, and some key focus of social areas that we're focusing. And in the interest of time, I've just listed out the major ones here. Stakeholder engagement. Now, this is central to assessing social risks and impacts and designing appropriate mitigation and management measures. It has to be culturally appropriate, and it has to be inclusive and participatory. In my experience of working in infrastructure development very closely with the communities, there is a lot of room to strengthen this area, because this is the premise of how mitigation measures are developed. This is the premise of how we even understand what the vulnerabilities are within the area of the project. So it allows for gender and vulnerability consideration. It also helps us tap into the vast indigenous knowledge on local resources, as well as design on climate resilient infrastructures. And lastly, in stakeholder engagement, grievance mechanism, a mechanism in a place that's two-way, that allows for a two-way conversation between the project and the communities is going to be extremely critical in ensuring good social performance in a project. And we highlight this with the companies and the clients that we work with. Land-based impacts, one of the major critical impacts in infrastructure development, green growth, in climate smart infrastructure, all kinds of infrastructure that we're talking about when we're moving away, moving towards green infrastructure. This is one of the impacts. And we want to make sure that the companies and the clients have the necessary tools to do a good resettlement planning, and making sure that oftentimes impacts on informal and users and tenants, they're always oftentimes overlooked. So making sure that we're incorporating all of that, making sure that we're taking climate hazard considerations into resettlement planning. By that, when you're building a new house, that is climate resilient infrastructure, or when you're moving communities to a new place, it has to be an area which has reduced climate risks, and so on. The other thing that we look at is livelihood restoration. Impacts to livelihood is very critical, and livelihood restoration is always the most challenging aspects of social safeguards, ensuring social safeguards. So we want to ensure that it's taken as a development opportunity to address existing climate challenges in livelihood. The kind of projects that we see that we work on, the major livelihoods are on agriculture, on fishing, on access to ecosystem services in the area. So we want to focus, for example, within agriculture, it can be taken as a development opportunity to now focus on climate smart agriculture and so on. So livelihood restoration is also another of our key focus. Cultural resources, impacts to tangible and intangible cultural heritage resources, impacts to indigenous communities can be strengthened. We're also working with organizations like the UNESCO and the government organizations to make sure that the cultural heritage impact assessment is also included in the environmental impact assessment. And lastly, labor issues. It also came up in other presentation, workers' protection rights, supply chain issues, which is always overlooked and which has grave implications on social performance, labor influx that's often overlooked, labor influx and its impact on the community health and safety and security. So we want to focus on labor issues as well as all the other issues that I just mentioned on social safeguards. Again, saying that these are, we also look at other issues, but these are the main ones that we're focusing on right now. Now, how do we do this with the companies, the projects, our beneficiaries that we're working with? We are focusing on a few things. One is training and capacity building, and realizing that one-off training is never enough to really have a good understanding of the application of ESG in implementing these projects. So we're focusing on regular training and advisory services to the project team. In addition to that, contractor management is going to be key. At the end of the day, contractors are the one who are going to be building the project on the ground. So making sure that the policies that's been developed at the corporate level, at the project level, flows down to the contractors, and making sure that there's a monitoring mechanism in place to ensure compliance is going to be very critical in ensuring good social performance. Because as with everything, it's easy to write things on a report, but it's very difficult to implement them unless there's a monitoring and a compliance, strong compliance in place. So that's another focus that we're doing with our clients. And development of tools, frameworks, and best practices. In our interaction with the companies that we're working with, one of the major assistance that they would like to see is also helping them with tools and frameworks and best practices. So to give you an example, social safeguards, or we would say that you have to have a grievance mechanism in place. But what does that mean in terms of operationalizing on the ground? So we want to make sure that we help develop these tools so that projects can actually have something to know the systems in place, the tools in place, the best practices in place, to contextualize in the project area that they're working with, but they have the tools to do it. So we're also working on that, not just on grievances, on other issues like benefit sharing. How do you maximize benefits to the local communities and so on? The other element is promoting JESI responsive procurement. Again, from an angle of benefit sharing, how do you make sure that all the benefits are also extended to the local communities? And especially in the Mekong sub-region, a lot of SMEs that are owned by women entrepreneurs, making sure that we're tapping into or we're providing services to the women businesses to the extent possible. As one example, would be something that we're going to be working with the companies. Another key one will be management system. Now, this is one of the major there's a major room to work on management systems, because this is key to, again, ensuring that you can operationalize all these standards on the ground. So we want to help companies develop these management systems in place, which, there's background noise here, which focuses on policies, which focuses on human resources, making sure that they have the team to do these project and so on. And last but not the least, we're also focusing on capacity building of CBOs, making sure that they understand the risks of the projects, they know what to ask when we go and do our EIA disclosures and so on, to promote accountability. I know I rushed through, but in the interest of time, I'll stop right here. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to take them. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Srijana, for highlighting the importance and expanding field of mitigating social impacts related to infrastructure development, including how climate change affects decisions about resilience and community impact, and how financial and non-financial risks are a major lever for encouraging companies to act. So folks, this brings us to our Q&A session, where our panel of esteemed presenters can respond to questions you may have. Please take the time now to input your questions directly via the Q&A tab in your interface. Okay, we have a few coming in. Let's get started on this first one. It's a question for Kun Seng at USTDA. for grants and training programs like the ones for EGAT and the Thai Rail Authority, how do you follow through and measure impacts over time? Or is it purely non-binding?
Thank you, Winston, for the question, Sam. As I noted, in my presentation, our grants and partnership building programs are not tied, or as the audience has put it, they are non-binding. So, but having said that, we do actually have a dedicated monitoring and evaluation team to help follow up with the partners, and tracking on the status of the project implementations, and any commercial successes for US companies at the same time as well. And we do this like over a very long time horizons, and can be over 10 plus years, and so be warned if you want kind of like to accept our grants, and really just sort of depending on the status of the project implementation. I would note that these are kind of like typically very large scale infrastructure projects that we support, and they can take very long time to kind of design, build, and construct. So hence why we do track these successes and project implementation over a very long time frame. I hope that answers the questions. Thanks.
Okay, great. This next question comes from, and I'm sorry if anybody else had on the panel had something to say in response to that question. Please do. But if not, okay, great. This next question comes from Joel. Sounds like it's primarily for Srijana, though others may have opinions as well. The question is, what improvements in benefit sharing have been achieved by adopting improved management systems?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. Thank you. So when we talk about benefit sharing, we're talking about different angles of benefit sharings, right? One could be equity sharing in the project. One could be improving access to employment, making sure that you're employing people who are local. One could be sourcing local resources from the community. So there are different aspects of benefit sharing. Now, when you develop an ESMS, which also includes a policy, which says this is the policy of the company, this is what we're trying to achieve through the projects that we build, you would also at that stage start brainstorming about how can we maximize benefits from our project to the communities in terms of rural electrification if you're building a energy project, or it depends on the projects that you're building in. So what ESMS does is really try to help companies look at the overall objective and how to operationalize it on the ground. So that's what it does.
Great. Our next question is, I think, more broad for the panel. What are some of the ways that the USAID and Australia can jointly collaborate on clean energy transition in the region? There are several shared goals for both governments. Yes. Maybe we start with Kun Sang. It looked like you were ready to try to tackle that question.
I'm happy to, but just noting that the question actually noted, USAID and Australia. So I'm not sure if I'm appropriate to, take the initial stab at that question. But I'm happy to, just by noting that, USAID tools and our fundings are very flexible and can be quickly deployed to ensure the successful implementation of some of the shared values and goals that was asked by the audience as well. I hope that but would defer to others to kind of weigh in on how else they would want to kind of further work on this.
Okay, thanks. Anybody else on the panel? And I'll take the cue that you'd like to speak if I see you go off mute. Okay, over to you, Nam.
Thank you. And yeah, really good question. Really, really timely, because recognizing the value of collaboration, the energy transition is a global challenge and requires global efforts. So it is definitely something that USAID and Australia have been exploring, have been thinking about, and it really comes down to, I think, looking for the right opportunities that can draw on the right mix and balance of their strengths and expertise. On a more substantial level, I personally see lots of good opportunities and potential synergies for the blending of teams to provide the support across the whole, if we want to call it, energy infrastructure life cycle, all the way from the very, very start, whether that's at the influencing of the policy setting and even before that, all the way through to a pilot project or something resulting in physical construction. And along those ways, there's obviously lots of different challenges and steps, and the breadth of tools and programs across not just USAID, but I think the US program portfolio as well as Australia can really result in something potentially meaningful, and certainly looking to explore that. At a more simple level, something that is much more, I think, short-term and transactional. I think in dealing with our Southeast Asian partners, there's an increasing demand or request to understand experiences in the energy transition from all over the world, not just Australia, and I presume not just US. And so at a more kind of manageable, there's certainly ways to just collaborate on some of these more simple knowledge sharing and then capacity building type requests. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you, Nam. Would anybody else on the panel like to take that question?
Hi, Winston. This is Maria here from DFC. Maybe just to add, I think more generally, the partners, both Australian and US, featured on the panel today can work at different segments of an investment, a climate investment. So what I mean by that is if you look at the life cycle of an investment, USAID is prominent in many markets in Southeast Asia. They have a mission. They're already doing a lot of work in terms of regulatory reform and capacity building in order to facilitate economic growth and support of those climate investments. USTDA then comes along with also its project preparation tools to support investments at the early stage, such as with pre-feasibility or feasibility studies. P4I and the Mekong Australia partnership can come and provide advisory services, either from a technical standpoint on a specific climate or investment related project, to bolster technical capacity building in a particular way, or provide environmental, social, and governance advisory services to meet international standards. And then once the investment or project in climate is looking for capital, actual long-term capital, either in the form of debt or equity, that's where DFC can play a role and provide long-term capital. So I think what's valuable to take from this discussion is that we each have different tools, but if you can apply them holistically through the ecosystem, I think we can provide a lot of benefit to supporting these climate goals throughout Southeast Asia, and particularly helping Southeast Asian countries reach their NDC goals, along with our respective mission objectives on climate.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Maria. Would anybody else on the panel like to take this question? Okay, well, moving on. Our next question is wondering for the panel more generally, what are some of the main challenges to private sector actors developing sustainable infrastructure in Southeast Asia, and how can the US and Australia help to overcome these?
I'm happy to take an initial stab, Winston's. From my perspective, as countries are thinking about sustainable infrastructures in Southeast Asia to support things like their climate ambitious climate ambitions, for example, you need a variety of technological solution to to realize these goals. So what we are seeing is that a lot of the countries, for example, in Thailand, they're exploring a lot of new technologies that they don't necessarily have the the technical expertise and sort of locally, for example, just because there's just not a lot of these kind of similar types of projects already being implemented locally. For example, we have requests from like countries like Thailand or Indonesia to support on things like green hydrogens or battery energy storage system or carbon capture storage and utilization system, for example. So these are kind of like these are new technologies that are not sort of commercially readily commercially available sort of globally. So there are some technical gaps there. So what USTDA is trying to do is we're trying to kind of help bring international expertise from the US to help kind of fill that gap for our partners in the regions. So so that's kind of and I'm sure kind of our colleagues in Australia would have similar expertise to share on this front as well. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Kun Sang. Would anybody else in the panel like to take this question?
Certainly, this is Maria here from DFC. I think another challenge that we see in the market is diversification. So, in order to provide and promote sustainable climate, whether that include renewable energy and promotion of reduction in methane emissions or greenhouse gas emissions, I think there needs to be sort of legislation put forth to prioritize some ancillary infrastructure that's critical. So, for example, in some markets in Southeast Asia, in order to provide more reliability in terms of renewable energy that's coming onto the grid, there needs to be some diversification in terms of opening up investment for the private sector to support transmission and distribution lines to help augment and provide capital that's necessary to support either curtailment issues that are happening in the market or to facilitate distribution of the generation capacity in a more reliable way. The other thing is in terms of regulatory enabling points as well, climate is cross-cutting in terms of a variety of sectors. It could include clean energy, but also it has a lot of overlap into the agribusiness and food security space, giving thought to prioritizing specific targeted regulations that would really incentivize communities to adapt clean energy or clean energy efficiency techniques in relation to agribusiness production is another opportunity that I think is untapped, and we could certainly work to support that through our various regulatory tools of those institutions around the table, technical advisory services, and then financing.
Excellent. Thank you, Maria. Would anybody else on the panel like to take this question about the main challenges of private sector actors in sustainable infrastructure in Southeast Asia? Nam?
Thank you, Winston, and thank you, Seng and Maria, for setting the platform. And I think the only thing I would like to also add, just from an energy-specific perspective, is the role of the standards, particularly for new types of renewable energy technologies, things around safety, design, installation, monitoring. They're the types of things which we are particularly hearing as an additional challenge in addition to things like regulations and bankability. Thank you.
Okay, excellent. Let's make a little room for some other questions here, unless anyone else would like to take that last question. All right, moving on. We have a question over here. As the world transitions to clean energy, it's appearing more and more that solar, wind, and other variable renewable energy can only constitute a fraction of countries' electricity needs. Where does the US and Australia stand on support for deploying nuclear energy? All right, would Would anyone on the panel like to step into that one?
I'm happy to start, but I must admit, we don't have a lot of experience or any experience actually as an agency supporting nuclear projects within Southeast Asia regions. But I know that our global team has been kind of like supporting nuclear, especially the kind of the nuclear SMR projects in Eastern Europe. So I believe, and this is kind of like an area that my understanding is that our agency is trying to promote, and just because because of the recent developments in the nuclear SMR technologies recently, and the fact that we consider this to be one of a solution for countries to meet their ambitious climate targets as well. So, but as I noted, this is not the regions that I follow, so I can't speak too much about it. But I know it is a priority. One of the priority technologies for USTDA within the energy sector to support. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Gunsang. That's interesting. It sounds like the U.S. does support nuclear deployment to some extent in SMRs in different regions in the world. Maria?
Thank you, Winston. Maybe just to add from DFC's perspective, we too are taking a very targeted approach. I think we, tend to look at each investment within the investment context and then the country context. So we would want to first understand the generation capacity and landscape of that particular country and how perhaps a small nuclear power reactor or a small modular reactor might enhance the base load or in that particular context. But I can share with you that we are looking at an opportunity to support and finance a small modular reactor in another part of the world, and it isn't in Southeast Asia. But again, it's ultimately driven, as I noted, by the commercial viability and the sustainability as to how that investment would be additive to the overall mix of generation capacity in that country context. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Maria. Would anybody else like to take that question on support for nuclear energy? All right, moving on. We have this next question over here. Maria, this looks like it's specifically for you. Does DFC provide financing for development or insurance to de-risk against climate impacts, including climate resilient infrastructure? And are there some examples?
That's a great question. DFC does provide a variety of financing. It's mostly commercial-based risk, so we do not have a product that de-risks climate incidents or climate change events. Having said that, we are working with a few partners in the market, some recognized names that provide climate-based insurance alongside our financing. So together, we're putting together in place a structure whereby which DFC is extending long-term financing for the investment that's needed. And then we're bringing in or crowding in partners that are providing climate-triggered insurance to cover those climate-related losses. So in a sort of a blended finance approach. So if you have something of that nature that you're interested in speaking to DFC about, I'd be pleased to explore that with you. My contact details are at the end of the DFC presentation.
Great, and thank you, Maria. And it looks like we're coming on one last question over here. It's more on the Australian side. What has Australia done at home to address climate change and infrastructure? It would be great to know more about the best practices Australia could bring to the region regarding energy generation. What are some of the big private sector players? Nam, I'm assuming that question, it's probably for you.
Yeah, it is. I'm just wondering if Shajay Julia Feeney is also on the line, given there was a little bit of a question alluding to the Australian government's kind of policy, and noting that the new Australian government has only been in place for a few weeks, and it is a fairly sort of quickly moving area. And I know there's a lot of discussions in Canberra on this topic, and it would probably be more appropriate for a member of the Australian government to respond to this. So if that's okay, I would like to take that on notice.
Okay, thank you, Nam. I was just informed that Julia had to leave, so unfortunately can't respond to that question. If you had any other remarks for that question, that would be great too. But if not, that's okay. We're coming over time as it is. Okay, so thanks to everybody for a great Q&A session. Before we conclude and before everyone starts closing windows, I beg those in the audience to please, again, click on the feedback tab and fill out the event survey you'll see before you. Very, very important to get that feedback again. So for events like this, we know what we're doing right and wrong, and how we can do things better as well. So really appreciate it if you just click that feedback tab and fill that survey out. It means a lot to us. That said, thanks to both Steve and Julia of USAID and DFAT, and again to our technical presenters, Maria, Kunseng, Namli, and Sujana. Together we can move the massive infrastructure investments in the region towards sustainability. Thanks everybody, especially the audience, for joining as well. I wish you all good health, good fortune, and a great rest of your week here at the Asia Clean Energy Forum 2022. Please be well.